Good evening. Jim Wallace is my name, and I hold the chair of Faith and Justice here at the McCourt School of Public Policy. And I'm founding director of the Georgetown University Center on Faith and Justice. When a university takes your two favorite words and makes them into a chair and a center, you're a happy camper. So I'm glad to be here tonight. And I want to give a big warm welcome to all of you who are here and those watching online. It is really great to see you all tonight. So we are gathered together tonight with a very timely event. And we're here to confront an ideology on the rise in our country. It's rooted in America's original sin, the sin of white supremacy. But now that old ideology is being undergirded by an old heresy with a new name called white Christian nationalism. I would say that white Christian nationalism is the single greatest threat to democracy in America. Let me say it again. I think the chief obstacle now to a multiracial democracy in this country is indeed white Christian nationalism. It's also the greatest threat to the integrity of the Christian witness. But I would say, whether you have faith or no faith at all, this is important to all of us, no matter who we are. So the very moment, as we speak tonight, white Christian nationalists are working to disempower black and brown Americans through an age-old tactic called voter suppression. I'm on calls every day. Early voting has started, and so has voter suppression all over the country. In states across the country right now, trained activists and even armed vigilantes are planning to aggressively challenge, that's their word, challenge and interrogate voters in poor, black, and brown neighborhoods. Why? Because they're not the right kind of Americans. Why? Because they're not white Americans. So this isn't just an academic subject, it's on the ground as we speak, leading up to these midterm elections. In the words of retired General Michael Flynn, a MAGA Republican who served in the Trump administration, and now is a leader in the white Christian nationalist movement, the people whose votes they're trying to suppress, he says, walk like us, talk like us, but they do not want what we want. So what do white Christian nationalists want, and how can we prevent them from getting what they want? These are topics for tonight's conversation, and how to win people back and win people over. Every movement, I often say, needs to know who they can persuade and who they can defeat. We need to persuade people, but there are forces in the air and on the ground that also must be defeated. So we're here tonight to talk about all that, and I couldn't be more glad to host these experts, these voices, on stage to help us answer those questions. Let me introduce them. The Reverend Michael Curry is presiding bishop and primate of the Episcopal Church. He serves as the Episcopal Church's chief pastor, spokesperson, I'd say preacher, and president and chief executive officer. Bishop Curry was ordained a priest in 1978, and throughout his ministry, Bishop Curry has been a prophetic leader, particularly in the areas of racial reconciliation, evangelism, and climate change. Amanda Taylor is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee and lead organizer of the group Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Pretty good name, I think. She leads the BJC as it upholds the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against its establishment by the government. Amanda graduated magna cum laude, I should add, from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, with a bachelor's degree in foreign service. And BJC is a co-sponsor of this event tonight, so we thank her for that. And Dr. Samuel Perry is among the nation's leading expert scholars on conservative Christianity in American politics, along with numerous articles published in leading academic journals. Perry has authored or co-authored 4 books, including Taking America Back for God and The Flag and the Cross. All are, in my view, must-reads. He's widely recognized as an expert, I would say an influential scholar and frequent critic of white Christian nationalism. So let's all give a warm welcome to our panel. So we're going to have a conversation together up here and then open this up to you. Join us in that conversation. So, Dr. Sam Perry, can I call you Sam?
Sure, please.
So, Sam, white Christian nationalism is, I would say, a slippery concept, in part because their beliefs and actions often seem so contradictory. Like they're Christians, but they seem to condone violence sometimes. So there's contradictions here. So help us understand this. I think the name white Christian nationalism spells its heresy. The name spells the heresy. So how is it white, how Christian, and how nationalistic?
Well, that's a good one. Okay, so I think the issue of definitions is actually extremely important. And whenever we talk about white Christian nationalism, I want to be very clear about what exactly we're defining, because what I don't want to do, and I think this has unfortunately been the case as the concept itself has taken on popularity, it can become even more slippery, and it starts to be used for any kind of religion and politics, which is not what we want to convey. We don't want to try to discourage people from voting their values, or to try to tell Christians, hey, you need to hang your faith at the door and not bring that into politics, as if that was even possible. In fact, that has been an accusation. A week and a half ago, the Family Research Council, along with leaders like Tony Perkins, Michelle Bachmann, some other leaders that they had on stage, they hosted an event where they talked about the rise of this term white Christian nationalism, or Christian nationalism. And in their advertising materials, they said that this term has been used to try to suppress the votes of conservative Christians. So they actually believe that it is used to try to discourage any conservative Christians from voting. That's not what we want to do. We want to be very clear about what we mean. So how is it white? How is it Christian? How is it nationalist? So I actually think white Christian nationalism is best understood as at least 3 things. We could talk about it 3 different things. First, it is an ideology that idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a very particular kind of Christianity. And that is a Christianity that isn't characterized by, say, giving my life to Jesus or wanting to be a good disciple, but it is about white Christian ethnoculture. A desire that traditionalist Christian subculture that characterizes people like us, that we have been in charge and that we are the rightful rulers, and our culture should hold sway and should be institutionalized in American political life. It is also a political strategy, and increasingly a political strategy that is leveraged by people who don't necessarily have to believe the ideology. So, for example, a good example of this is Trump. Trump, I think it's fair to say, I don't mean to be hypercritical, but I think it's fair to say that Trump probably doesn't believe much of anything other than, he believes in winning, he believes in his own influence, and yet he is more than willing to leverage white Christian nationalist rhetoric to be able to mobilize those audiences who do believe that. And lastly, we are seeing white Christian nationalism is increasingly becoming an identity in and of itself. It's increasingly being something that people are now embracing as a name, as a term, and calling themselves Christian nationalists. Now, why is it white? Let me make sure I'm clear about that. Oftentimes, we find in our surveys that people of color affirm our questions that we ask about Christian nationalist ideology. They affirm those statements with the same regularity that white Americans do. It's not just a white thing. But we find consistently that when white Americans tick the box on these kinds of ideologies, these kinds of beliefs, that America is a Christian nation, we should institutionalize it as such, that we should get back to our Christian heritage, Christian values, no separation of church and state, those kinds of things. It means something fundamentally different for white Americans than it does for people of color, especially African Americans. For white Americans, it seems to connect with this idea of nostalgia for an earlier time where the right people were in charge, where the right cultural values held sway. When African Americans affirm those same kinds of questions, it does not seem to indicate that they want to go back to an earlier time where the right people were in charge or had those values held sway. It is more aspirational. It seems to evoke the idea that America should have been a nation that valued justice, that valued equality, but never quite became that. And so what makes it white? It seems to be, this ideology at least, it seems to be organized, this idea that America is founded by and for people who are shaped by white Christian ethnoculture.
Mm-hmm. So picking up on that, Bishop Curry, you're a black man in America and a church leader who grew up in the South. So I want to ask you how white Christian nationalism has personally affected your life. How big a threat is it to you and your country? And what do you fear most about white Christian nationalism?
Well, I think what we're describing as white Christian nationalism, let me frame it that way, is not conservative Christianity. Obviously, it's not liberal Christianity either. Mm-hmm. What we're actually describing is an ideology that's not really a religion. But it looks like a religion and invokes language and symbols that have religious trappings. Mm-hmm. So I want to distinguish between genuine evangelicals, conservative Christians who are conservative. Believe it or not, when you get Jesus in your heart, you could turn out to be a Republican as well as a Democrat. You see, Jesus isn't about that. I mean, there's some values that come with that, but how you apply those in your life can vary. What we're describing and what the professor is really getting at is something that has been around a long time. Now, I think some innocent people are being fooled by it. Let me be clear about that. It's been around a long time. Let us not forget that chattel slavery in America was justified by pro-slavery Christian-sounding voices. That's right. Now, when you take those arguments and lay them alongside Jesus of Nazareth, let's just take Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. I'm just picking one passage. Or let's just take Luke 4, or let's just take Matthew 25, or let's just take all four of the Gospels, lay the image of Jesus of Nazareth that you see there alongside the arguments that were used to maintain slavery, and you will see a wide gap that cannot be closed. The same is true if you look at the complex of white Christian nationalism as an ideology. You lay it alongside Jesus of Nazareth, and we're not even talking about the same thing. Right. So that's why I think it's important to make a distinction, and that's what you've done, between what is an ideology, which in America you have the right to hold, but I would argue you don't have the right to claim that it's Christian. Right. If you want to exclude folk, if you don't want to live, what Jesus was real clear, you shall love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. On these two hang all the law and the prophets. That's it. I mean, he just said everything Moses was talking about. That's it. Now, does this sound like loving neighbor? No. If I love my neighbor, I want my neighbor to be as safe and secure as I am. I want my neighbor to have the same rights that I do. But once upon a time, and I remember my grandma talking about this from Eastern North Carolina, she talked about the hooded men. And when I was a little kid, I didn't know what grandma was talking about, the hooded men. I didn't know what she was talking about. She was talking about the Klan brothers. They claimed to be Christian. Now, was that Christianity? Really? Was that Christian? Lay that next to Jesus. And you begin to discover that we're not talking about a religious perspective at all. We actually are talking about an ideology that is cloaked in religious language and that uses religious symbols, but that actually isn't that at all. And I think part of our task, and these guys are better at it than I am, but part of our task is to help normal people, the sensible center, to be clear that, wait a minute, Christianity is about the way of Jesus of Nazareth. It is about the way of living love in our lives for real. and anything that's not that is not Christianity. It can be something else. I mean, in America, you got a right to your opinion. Right or wrong, you got a right to it. But it's not that. And so I just think right on target. But I want to frame this as really not religion at all, but ideology.
In fact, it's the use and abuse of religion for ideology or for an ethnic culture or for a political agenda.
Yeah.
Right? I've often struck by how a lot of new white Christian nationalists weren't before practicing people of faith at all, but now they're white Christian nationalists. So Amanda, you have studied this as much as anybody, your organization. In fact, you lead a group called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I love that title. I want to ask you, is white Christian nationalism a bigger threat to our democracy or to the churches, or both? And is it, as Bishop Curry was suggesting, mainly a political movement or a religious movement, or both?
Well, I'm going to add another threat. It's a huge threat. I think I agree with you that it's the biggest threat to our democracy today. I think it's a huge threat to a faithful Christian life and to a flourishing Christianity in this country. And I think it's the single biggest threat to religious freedom for all that we face in America today. Because Christian nationalism as a political ideology and a cultural framework creates second-class citizens for everyone who's not Christian. Right. In their view. And so I think we can boil down every threat to religious freedom into that foundational value that that can unite us as Americans. You know, Christianity cannot and does not unite us as Americans, but what can unite us as Americans is this foundational value that our belonging in American culture and society will never be premised on what we believe or how we practice or how we identify religiously or even if we identify as a religious person. Right. So I think we have to be very clear that these are threats to all of these things that we hold dear as Americans, as Christians, and as people who value religious freedom. I do think that it is primarily a political movement, and I agree that we have to distinguish it from Christianity. And I think based on just what you were saying about how complicit the church was in slavery, in segregation, in lynchings, in all of those things that came, that we have to acknowledge that American Christianity has been compromised by Christian nationalism for centuries. And so I would love to be able to completely separate the two and say that they have nothing to do with each other, and I think we cannot do that. And that's one of the things we are trying to do at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, is ask individual Christians and congregations to be very self-critical and to examine their own theologies and religious practices and see how much has Christian nationalism impacted my understanding of Christianity. Because if we don't get right with our own theologies and our own practice first, we won't be able to be the kind of witness we need to the rest of the world to dismantle Christian nationalism.
Indeed. Now, Sam, you wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post this week, some of you probably read, that was, is white Christian nationalism growing or declining? And you said your answer was both. How is it both declining and growing at the same time?
Yeah. So we've been tracking Christian nationalist ideology for a number of years now. We have data that we've asked similar questions for about 15 years. These are people who started these questions earlier, and we've carried these on just to see how this is changing. And we found that since about 2017, the percentage of Americans who say that the federal government should declare us a Christian nation has declined by about 10%, from about 30% to 20% most recently. That's not a huge drop, but we have several indicators. Pew data has shown this as well. There are several indicators that in the general population, explicit affirming of Christian nationalist ideology among just average people seems to be declining somewhat. Now, does that mean that Christian nationalism is on its dying gasp or about to leave? No, because polarization is such to where Christian nationalism as an ideology, as a political strategy, and as an identity has become a more central facet of American politics, even as grassroots Americans are backing away from explicit identification with those ideologies. you've got, it has become an even greater part of the Republican Party platform, of the kind of rhetoric that conservative politicians who are trying to appeal to a reactionary white Christian base who is very anxious and very angry, to be able to use those kinds of identifying rhetorics, that kind of language of Christian nationalism, the idea that our heritage is being stolen from us, that we need to go back to an earlier time, to use that kind of explicit rhetoric, that has become a more central focus of our politics. And again, this phenomenon, I mean, I think this question actually goes into what is old about Christian nationalism and what is new. So let me talk about that for a second. What is old is exactly what the bishop was talking about. This ideology, and Amanda, is centuries old. This ideology that America is for people like us, and they are white, they are Christian, they are native born. But what we see as new is actually how closely tied it is now to political strategy and rhetoric. That is a new thing. How explicit the language of us versus them, anti-Christian persecution, that we are white Americans and Christians are being persecuted and attacked, that we need to take our country back. That is more explicit. But also the identification with the label itself, that people can write books arguing for Christian nationalism by name, that people can take to Twitter, politicians can take to Twitter and say, the Republican Party ought to be the party of Christian nationalism. That is a new thing. And so the more that becomes the, Republican partisanship or conservative ideological identity becomes coalesced around that identity of Christian nationalists, then that becomes something that its influence belies the shrinking numbers, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So it's become politicized
Right.
and strategized, and I would say even weaponized.
Yes.
Now,
Yep.
and that's the new dimension here. So Bishop Curry, you and I have been fighting this kind of stuff together for a long time, and yet this kind of stuff keeps growing. So I wonder sometimes, what are we doing wrong? Or what's the story that we need? Or you and I were involved in this movement called Reclaiming Jesus, and I heard you say something about that a few moments ago. Isn't coming back to that the only way to deal with politicized religion? What do we do different, and how can we go forward now in a better way?
You know, I do think, I think on the one hand it's always important whenever any form of exclusion, I'm hedging from the word bigotry because that's a little bit narrowly
Right.
focused, but anything that excludes other folk, anything that puts other folk down, even implicitly,
Right.
anything like that. People of decency and goodwill, whether they're Christian, Jews, Muslim, whatever they are, people of decency and goodwill must stand up and must name it. Silence is complicity. And silence creates a context in which something like that can grow. And when something like that can grow and is allowed to grow, it is like kudzu. I mean, y'all don't have kudzu up north, but anybody know about kudzu? I mean, you got to get a goat to take care of kudzu. That's about the only thing that'll stop it. I mean, and it just starts spreading. I mean, just starts spreading. So it has to be, you've got to confront, name it. When a synagogue is assaulted, Christians, Muslims, people of goodwill must stand up and say, this is not the way we want to be. When, and on, I can just go down the list. When LGBTQ folk are attacked, when trans folk are attacked, people of decency and goodwill, no matter what your political, must stand up and speak up. Silence creates an atmosphere for the negative to grow. It really does. So I think that's one thing. I think that we have to have ecumenical, interfaith, bipartisan, multiracial, multicultural, multireligious coalitions of people who just want to stand up for human kindness and decency. So we got to do that. On the other hand, I do think there does have to be the kind of education is a weak word, but the kind of education that brings this conversation to the public to awareness.
Right.
That there is a counter narrative. There actually is a way of being Christian that is not exclusive, that is not about putting folk down, that you may vote your way and I may vote my way based on our values and our own discernment, that there is that kind. But that kind of Christianity, see, that's why I think reclaiming Jesus was significant. Because sometimes you hear folks saying this is Christianity and they ain't saying nothing about Jesus. Now, I mean, you got to get real at some point and say, hold on, let's talk about the brother. He's supposed to be the Lord. Let's let him be the Lord. And so claiming and reclaiming that and just lifting up, and we talked about the power of the text. Yeah. Lift up the text of the New Testament, specifically the four Gospels. Let Jesus speak. Remember that thing, let your fingers do the walking through the yellow pages years ago? Somebody just walk through the text a little bit and let Jesus talk. Mm-hmm. And then let's lay Jesus aside, anything that claims to be Christian. And if it doesn't match up, then we say, well, that's not Christianity. It may be your opinion. You got a right to your opinion in this country. And I think that kind of education of just normal people. When I say normal, I don't mean anybody's abnormal, but just the normal folk who go to church, who may be, look, I'm the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. I know full well there are Republicans and Democrats in the Episcopal Church. I don't even need a survey to find that out. I gotta know that. But I'm here to tell you, sensible, good, decent people who are really just trying to be Christian. Right. When they see it, they'll say, I thought that's what it was, but I'm beginning to hear some other things that seem like a different narrative. Mm-hmm. Help them, that kind of education, the kind of thing you're doing and the kind of thing you're doing. We need more of that. And people like me and ordinary clergy, normal clergy in congregations to begin to re-educate ourselves to this Jesus of Nazareth and his way of love as God's way of life. And when we do that, then we can begin to discern. Like the New Testament says in 1 John, test the spirits to see whether they be of God or not.
Mm-hmm. So a good story beats a good argument.
Every day.
So if we just argue about this forever, we're going to be stuck in those little binary categories. Mm-hmm. So what's a story that gets us out of those categories? Yeah. So Amanda, you have warned there's been a dramatic uptick in violent acts inspired by white Christian nationalism, which has been more and more openly embraced. Now we see people with T-shirts, even members of Congress with T-shirts. I'm a white Christian nationalist. It's becoming a T-shirt movement as well, right? So these are threats. They are political threats. They are violent threats. Tell us what you see going on around this during these midterm elections and that whole conversation, the campaigns. I've been reading about this so-called Reawaken America tour. People being baptized, almost like political baptisms, which we quite haven't seen before. The Washington Post calls this a traveling carnival of misinformation that merges entertainment, politics, and theology. Mm-hmm. So what do you see going on, particularly around this whole midterm election time?
Yeah, and before I hit the midterms, you bring up violence, and I have to say that tomorrow is a really somber anniversary. It's the 4-year anniversary of what remains the deadliest attack on Jews in America ever, the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue. And it was that event coming after other deadly events that really spurred us to action to create Christians Against Christian Nationalism. The fact that people were losing their lives when this ideology was in the hands of violent extremists, right, which makes what we're seeing in the midterm elections so irresponsible, right, because we know what this can lead to. This is not just about electing certain candidates to office, but people's lives are on the line. This Reawaken America tour has been on the road now for almost a year. It first caught my attention last November when there was an event in San Antonio, Texas, where Michael Flynn said the quiet part out loud. He said, we're one nation under God. We should have one religion. One nation under God, one religion under God. So we see what the aim is. This isn't just about repeating lines of civil religion. This is about leading to a theocracy, about one version of Christianity being taken over by the government. And so we've seen this kind of extremist rhetoric combined with misinformation, election lies, COVID lies, and put all in these huge arenas and often in houses of worship. Right. And it really is incredibly irresponsible to be exploiting this as a political strategy. And I think we are at a point that I fear that Christian nationalism is going to be normalized. And I think the only thing that can stop it is for normal people, to stand up and to say, this is not who we are, this is not who we want to be, either as Americans or for those of us who are Christians as Christians, and to do something about it. And it would be great to have some political leadership doing this as well. What's so alarming is when you have someone like a Marjorie Taylor Greene saying, the Republican Party should be the party of Christian nationalism. We didn't have leaders from the Republican Party saying, no, we shouldn't, right? And so then when we do have silence as complicity, then we have the danger of that overtaking. So, I think with all the, we will have to see whether these candidates who are espousing Christian nationalism actually prevail. That's incredibly alarming, because what could they do once they're in office? But just the use of the political rhetoric is dangerous and alarming as well.
I was on an interfaith call just today, and I was very moved when a young rabbi said, around the Tree of Life anniversary, he said, what meant so much to so many people in that synagogue is when Muslims came to gather around the church to defend the synagogue from its attacks. Muslims came to gather around the Tree of Life synagogue, and how even they were offering to help pay medical bills of people who were attacked. This is the kindness that you were talking about, and the counter message to what we're being heard. So, Sam, you've written that the term Christian in white Christian nationalism is often a dog whistle or code language rather than an actual set of beliefs. How does white Christian nationalism use religion to hide race? Or how is whiteness the hidden link that transforms the story into a political vision? They want to say, I'm not a Christian nationalist. They sure don't want to say, I'm a white Christian nationalist. But it's there, it's the hidden link, I would say. So how do you see that? How do you expose that?
So part of this is something natural that we all do, is that we take categories of people. And when I say we all do it, I mean this is just a human thing that we tend to do, to lump people into categories together by association of how we think of them. So if I were to ask you to close your eyes, I do this with my students in my sociology of religion classes. I have them close their eyes, and I say, okay, I'm going to say some religious words: Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Southern Baptist, and so usually without exception, they all admit that when I said those religious words, they didn't just think a blank face. They saw a raced face. They saw, when I said Hindu, they thought of an Indian person, Buddhist, an Asian person, Muslim, maybe somebody from the Middle East, and Southern Baptist, they thought of a white person. It is because religion in the United States and elsewhere is racialized. We tend to associate groups with different ethnic backgrounds or different racial backgrounds based on geography, based on history, and those kinds of things. We have found experimentally, this is actually a really common phenomenon among white Christians, primarily because our religious institutions are segregated. Most of you go to most of us, those of us who attend church, are attending religious communities that tend to be segregated, where people who look like us live in our side of the tracks, think like us, talk like us, and that's most Americans. So the reason this becomes a powerful thing, and we've actually demonstrated this experimentally, is those connections can become so implicit and so closely connected that oftentimes referencing one of those identities implies the other one, and it makes people think about the other one. So let me give you an example. We did an experiment with a group of white Christians where we exposed them to different kind of narratives. We gave them different articles, and they were randomly assigned to these things. And we told this group of white Christians, we gave them several narratives. One was about Christians being persecuted. Another one was about white people being persecuted. Another one was about black people being persecuted. And we found that when white Christians read this article about white people being persecuted, it made them also think Christians were being persecuted as well. And when we gave them this article about Christians being persecuted, it made them think white people were being persecuted as well. Now, why is that relevant to our political situation now? Well, if I am a savvy politician and I'm speaking to a white conservative Christian audience that I know is making those connections, then I never have to say white at all. I can just keep on hammering this idea that Christians are persecuted. Christians are under attack. Our way of life is under attack. The anti-Christian left, the godless, atheist, socialist, woke left is coming for your God, for your rights, for your religious freedom. And I have talked about religion, but I have also implied all of these other things. Does that make sense? This is how nefarious white Christian nationalism as a political strategy can be, because I can keep on hammering this idea of anti-Christian persecution and who America really belongs to, Christians like us, when I am implying to these audiences white again and again. So it is actually a very powerful, it actually goes even deeper than dog whistle is a good word for it, because it signals to this group. But I often don't think these people are knowing they're even being signaled. I think it could actually work more like a trigger, like a Winter Soldier kind of trigger. Like I have given the code words and you have been activated to respond in this prescribed way with fear of the racial other, with xenophobia, with Islamophobia, with the fear of Black Lives Matter or Colin Kaepernick or whoever. That just because you have used this kind of like charged religious language now I think in racial terms. And that I think is a big danger with how this kind of rhetoric, this kind of this Christian persecution rhetoric is being used to stoke fear, not just against religious others, but against racial others.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the dog whistle means we got to name what Bishop Curry was saying. Name, this is white Christian nationalism,
Right.
not just Christian nationalism. So we got to give name to the dog whistle that's there, because it's core, and also it's reflecting the clear political vision and tactics that are going on now. So name it, as you were saying. So back to Amanda, white Christian nationalism showed up on January 6th. I mean, many of us were kind of struck by, placards and signs and Jesus is my Savior, Trump is my president. And they prayed on the floor of the Senate after they took it over. So what did you see in all that, and what have you seen since? We had Jamie Raskin here on these chairs a while ago, and the General Committee is talking about all of this going on, and they haven't really addressed directly this religion question. But we saw all that going on. So how do you interpret that from what you saw? And what do you see going forward now post January 6th?
Yeah. Well, like you and like probably most people in this audience, in addition to the horror of seeing what was going on at the Capitol on January 6th, it was only intensified to see symbols of my faith being used to attack democracy in Jesus' name. And so seeing that, and we had already been working at Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We at BJC, working with our partners at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, worked together with contributors like Sam Perry to put out a report that details all of the instances of Christian nationalism that we could find, not just on January 6th, but in the many events that led up to January 6th. And I think that's what's often missing in the conversation about Christian nationalism and January 6th, is how this ideology really worked to work this group into a place that would lead them to take these previously unthinkable actions of actually attacking the Capitol and trying to interfere with the election results using deadly force when they needed to. This report is available at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org, free downloads. And we did an event to talk about this earlier this year, and it instantly got the attention of Congress, including the January 6th committee. And so a group of us, including Jim and Bishop Curry, we signed a letter, we sent it to the January 6th committee and asked them to study Christian nationalism and what impact it had in bolstering and intensifying that attack on the Capitol. Because what we found is that it worked to unify a disparate group of people. There are a lot of different people who came to the Capitol that day, and some of them were from extremist groups like Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, and some of them were everyday Americans who got on a plane to fly there. How did they all come together? Christian nationalism helps explain why they did what they did. And so I think, Christian nationalism alone cannot explain what happened on January 6th, but we will not understand what happened on January 6th until we have a thorough accounting of Christian nationalism. So the committee has had a lot on their plate, including new evidence that came to light, and because of their investigation, the investigation's ongoing. But I really do hope that the committee will address Christian nationalism directly. And I think there is one thing we haven't talked about yet, but I think there is a concern on some people's parts that to attack Christian nationalism or to challenge Christian nationalism is in some way to challenge Christianity. And we hope that Christian voices can help say, no, not at all. Right. We think that you need to address Christian nationalism if we are going to have a strong Christian witness. And so we need more Christians, including Christian lawmakers, who are willing to take on Christian nationalism.
Clearly, if there was a religious undergirding to January 6th, it was this. It was white Christian. It was Christian placards and signs that made many of us just feel stunned and deeply sad and ashamed. But there was no other religious undergirding. It was this. And I think the committee is nervous about talking about religion in that political context for fear of it seeming divisive or attacking. So it's back to what Bishop Curry said. It's the question, this is my next question for you. Is this Christian? Is this Christianity? Is this, you and I talk about the need for a counter message. We can't just say white Christian nationalism is wrong, it's a threat, it's bad, let's all be against it. Because that falls into the old binaries. So how do we do a counter message where, no, this is not Christianity, this is something else, but it's not that. And that's why I like to focus on the gospel texts. It's almost like, here are the texts, right? Here are these iconic texts that we all know. You know these texts. And end the conversation with, do we believe it or not? If we believe it, we can't do this stuff. If we don't, let's say we don't. But then you can say, I don't believe those texts. So as you wrestle with this counter message, how do we go through the yellow pages, but the Gospels, I love that, fingers there. How do we get them? How do we get that out? That's more than education, what you said. It's really pastoring. You're the pastor of your church. It's formation. It's spiritual formation, not just education.
Yeah. The reality is, now I'm just dealing with Christians now. Let me just stay there. I've been ordained over 40 years now. I'm not as old as Jim Wallace, but I've been ordained for 40 years. But I must say that I'm not sure that I have effectively over those 40 years, and I think I've done some, I know I've done good, I'm not putting myself down, but I don't know that we have, but I'll speak for myself, effectively formed or helped as midwives to form the people who have been committed to our charge as pastors, to let, as St. Paul says, so that Christ is formed in them.
Yeah.
And so that their lives, our lives, actually reflect his life.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we've fallen short. Yeah. And I'll own that myself. But not stop there. Now the work is to actually engage the kind of formation that a counter-narrative that actually is a narrative of what Christianity is about. I mean, when we did Reclaiming Jesus, I mean, the truth is we were evangelical, we were mainline Protestant, we were Roman Catholic. I can't remember if we had any Orthodox there, and we spanned the spectrums.
Yeah.
I mean, in that room. But we were able to sit down and say, we can agree that this is what Jesus is about.
Yeah.
And it was pretty substantial. Now, if if an ecumenical group of Christians can say, okay, we're liberal, we're conservative, there were Republicans in there, Democrats, you name an issue, we're probably going to disagree on a whole lot. But the fact that there was a common core, you know, we talk about that in academia sometimes. There actually is a core of Christianity that if we lift it up and help folk begin to live in that and engage that as what Christianity is, that becomes the counter-narrative in and of itself when it is effectively lived and proclaimed. And I just think that's how you do it. You know, the thing is, something else struck me. I mean, Amanda said, I am struck. I mean, tomorrow is the anniversary of Tree of Life. The power of language and the danger of implicitly violent and exclusionary language coded in acceptable forms. That's seditiously dangerous because innocent people get fooled. And it's harder to counter that, although a counter-narrative does it. But sometimes that's where that has to be named. That when you're really talking about excluding folk, when you're really talking about hurting folk, when you're really talking about discriminating against folk, when that's really what's going on, that has to just be named. And named with love. Because you're better than that. I'm better than that. We're better than that. But that's got to be named. And anyway, I'm just saying that you should conjure that up, that we do have, I mean, it is not an accident. I was at Mother Emanuel, I guess it was last year, with the anniversary of the killings there. And literally, I went from there to Birmingham, where at an Episcopal church, folk had gotten. I mean, one day was one way, one another. The young man who was there, Liz Eaton from the ELCA, was there with us. The young man who did that, now he had a lot of issues. There's a lot going on, so it's not just a simple thing. But part of what motivated him, or catalyzed him, or triggered him, or whatever, was language of taking America back and making it a Christian nation again. It was. I grew up in both the North and the South. And in the North part is Buffalo, home of the Buffalo Bills, who are on a winning streak at the moment, but you never know where they last. But I grew up not far from that Tops grocery store. Used to ride my bike by there. The guy who did that was triggered again by this same rhetoric, this same languaging. Uvalde, a similar thing has been documented, that there was this language of violent, Robert McAfee Brown years ago taught us about violent language begets violence, and it can do it in subtle, insidious ways. And that's where it becomes dangerous, as you say. And we've got to counter that. I mean, we have got to counter that and name it. It's got to be named, and then help folk move beyond that and say, now here's what Christianity is about. And here's, that's, anyway, I'll stop. But
No, following up.
I don't even remember what your question was, but that's good.
That's the right question. Following up, you answered the question. Following up on that, Sam, I was struck, you called white Christian nationalism the San Andreas fault of American politics. And you end your book, Flag and the Cross, must read again, with a warning. You write that January 6th is not the end. We could see another violent power grab, larger and more violent than the first, which could bury American democracy for at least a generation. So do you think another event like that could be on the horizon, or something even more successful?
I think to the extent that political leaders are comfortable using that kind of divisive, reactionary rhetoric, this us versus them, that we are no longer Americans who share common values, but we are. And in fact, we're actually seeing something like this. A political scientist named Paul Jupe, who's done some phenomenal work. He's doing some work on Christian nationalism right now, and he's looked at how Christian nationalism corresponds to things like acceptance of violence against others, political violence. And he found that when Christian nationalism is combined with things like apocalyptic language and belief, a belief that we as a world, as culture, as a nation are headed towards some kind of apocalyptic, Armageddon-like battle between good and evil, that those two things combined together contribute to the acceptance of political violence, which makes complete sense, because on the Christian nationalism side, you've got this idea that something has been taken from you wrongly, and on the other side, you've got this idea that the stakes are so high that this is not just about Democrats versus Republicans. It's not about who won the latest election cycle and how'd you do in the midterms. It is literally God versus Satan, angels versus demons. And that's the kind of rhetoric we're seeing. So the Reawaken America tour and other speakers like Roger Stone. Roger Stone has gone on record several times in public speeches to say that this is not about Democrats and Republicans. This is about angels and demons. This is about if we lose, we plunge the nation to 1,000 years of darkness. Now, think about you sitting in the pews and you sitting and listening to that kind of rhetoric. What are the links to which you would go to prevent America from doing that? I mean, of course, that would stoke that kind of partisan violence. So I think to the extent that political actors are comfortable using that kind of rhetoric and language to divide, to up the stakes, and to say that this isn't just about political victories, this is actually some kind of a religious or God loses if we lose. Of course, I think you're setting yourself up for the kinds of conditions. Will it necessarily result in violence? I think it's a combination of conditions that leads to that. But I think you're certainly setting the ideological table for that to happen.
So we've talked about some very tough things tonight. This isn't just our topic for this month. Next month we'll move on to the next. This is with us. It's deep in us. So, but I want to end on a bit of hope here. Given all this, I'd like each of you to quickly offer some reasons why you think white Christian nationalism can be defeated. Each of you, give me some hope here about what we could, because out there I know a lot of you are not thinking, well, that's an interesting evening I went to. That was good. Now I'm going to go home and watch. I've got a couple shows to watch at home. So, no, this is you're thinking, what do I do? What do we do? What do we say? What do we do? How do we act? What do we do differently? So, give us, not that we have all the answers here, but each of you, give us just a quick sense of a bit of hope about how we can defeat this.
Well, I think we're starting in the right place by having a conversation about it, because Christian nationalism, as we pointed out, has been with us for centuries, and what has allowed it to be so persistent and pervasive is avoidance, is not tackling it, not getting to the foundation, the myth of America as a Christian nation. That's something that we haven't explicitly talked about tonight, but that's what all of Christian nationalism rests on, this false history of the United States. So what I'm seeing, and this is a place for hope and opportunity, I'll say, from more and more people coming out as Christian nationalists, is at least they're being open about what they are. And we can have a conversation instead of running away from that title. We can't have a conversation about it at that point. And when that happened, we saw media interest in this topic skyrocket. We've been working on this for years. We've had very few people in the media covering this, in mainstream media covering Christian nationalism. Suddenly, it's in the papers, it's on TV all the time. That is a good thing, because we are actually going to be getting people involved. The other sign of hope I have is the more I talk about being a Christian against Christian nationalism, I get comments like it's always a dangerous thing to read the comments, online, but in this case, it was a sign of hope. Because most of the comments were, finally, I'm a Christian and these people don't speak for me, and I'm so glad that you're out there in the public square. Me too, me
not
too.
alone, yeah.
So we need more of that to then engender someone to actually then be a public advocate as a voice for Jesus in the public square and a voice against Christian nationalism.
So Bishop Curry, your job is to bring hope. That's what you do.
It's the what?
Bring hope. Bring hope.
Oh.
Yeah, there you go. So bring us some hope here.
I'm saying amen to what she just said. Yeah, I've read St. Augustine, and I know about I've read Calvin. I know about human depravity. I know about the depths of sin and all the vicissitudes. I know all that stuff. And I've seen it.
Yeah.
But I also know what I believe. And I don't believe it on the evidence of anything that Michael Curry has. But I believe that Jesus was killed by an empire for doing good. And I believe he rose from the dead. Now, if I didn't believe that, then I'm not sure what I would, I don't know how I'd navigate it. But I believe that. And I believe, like I heard Desmond Tutu once say, he said it a lot, that because I believe that, I believe that good will triumph over evil, and that love will win over hate. But it will not happen, as Dr. King said, on wheels of inevitability. Mm-hmm. It will happen by good people, by people who want to be good, even if we're not, coming together. And I'm looking at Mary Ann Buddy, the Bishop of Washington, and one time, I don't know if she remembers this, she talked about mobilized love. Mm. That if we would mobilize love, and that we can, then there is nothing, there is no power, and I'm not talking about people now, no power of destruction, of hatred, of violence, of bigotry that can stop that. And I believe it.
So beyond all the polling and great work you're doing in the scholarship that sees this so deeply, what are your signs of hope these days?
I shouldn't have followed Bishop Curry. Why me? This is the last. I will bring it back to what I do, and that is look at the data. So I think one of the major reasons we're actually seeing a large uptick in the use of this kind of rhetoric and the use of this kind of language is because Donald Trump was victorious in 2016. So in 2012, the Republicans lose to Obama yet again, and they have this autopsy where they actually write a report. They say, hey, we as a party, we need to go in another direction. We need to let everybody know that we're an inclusive party, that we need to, there were a big tent kind of thing. We need to allow for everyone. We need to change our kind of appeal. And some Republican strategists said, no, we don't need to do that. What we need to do is we actually just need to mobilize this white working class kind of angry, anxious base. And we can do that with this guy. And so Trump's rhetoric was effective. And so subsequently, and his complete, repeated violations of norms, of democratic norms and presidential rhetoric and language, has demonstrably, we have study after study showing these kinds of things, it has increased the overtness with which people are now using that kind of rhetoric, not only in politics, but also just kind of average people. So to the extent that is no longer effective, I have confidence that it will become less appealing for politicians to use that. So this is, I really do think a lot hangs on the midterms and in 2024 as well. I don't just throw that out there, but it is very much a don't boo vote kind of move, like that Obama was famous for saying. It is something that I absolutely do. I share the same beliefs with my colleagues. I have hope that these conversations are happening, and this is a very positive thing. I'm glad we're naming it. And yet at the same time, this is the time to say that won't work, that we reject that. We repudiate that ideology, that rhetoric, this kind of tactic in politics. This is un-American. This is hopefully for Christians. This is unchristian. And so to the extent that we are effective in doing that, I have hope. I have hope. Yeah.
Bishop Buddy was acknowledged being here, and I remember very vividly when violence occurred to push protesters off Lafayette Square. And a political leader went to St. John's Church, your church, and held his Bible upside down, which to me symbolizes all of this. And my hope is that we will and can turn that Bible right side up again. Right side up again. And so I want the white Christian nationalists to know that we believe what Bishop Curry said, that we're giving an amen to that, not just with our claps, with our lives. But let's remember, that story didn't come without a cost. There's going to be cost to standing up to all this. But I want them to see that that we're not just their left critics, that we're people of faith, and we're going to take them on because of our faith. Okay? We're going to get preaching here before long. No more altar calls. But we do have time for some questions. So there are 2 microphones, I think. Yeah. Now here's the trick. A question. What defines a question? A question is a question. As radical as that seems, a question is a question, not a sermon. Sermons are good. We've heard some tonight. Yeah. But a question is a question. So please come and stand by the microphones, and we'll get to as many of you as possible. Yes, right here.
Hi, Reverend Wallace.
My students are out tonight.
Hi. My name's Kesley. I'm a sophomore in the college. I'm a history major, maybe a journalism minor, really just trying to graduate right now. My question is, so Georgetown University proclaims itself to be a Jesuit institution, and by extension, a Christian institution. So if we are saying that we have to call out the unchristian beliefs, the unchristian things that are being said, then how is the university actively going to play into that? Because currently they're not. They're platforming people here, having people like Mike Pence come and speak and spew further Christian nationalism under the guise of perfectly legitimate political discourse. So what should our school be doing? And I hope there are people from the administration here who can listen. And what should students be doing?
Well, you're referring to an event that recently occurred, right, here at Georgetown. The vice president came. I'm a Christian, Republican, American, and all that. I'm really eager to hear my classroom discussion about that tomorrow, because we'll take that up. I think that's Jesuit and Christian by extension. I don't believe it's by extension. I'm here because I walked in the night and I passed a banner that said, "Faith does justice." That's a banner. That's Jesuit. Faith does justice. I never saw those banners at Harvard, and I see them here. And I think they're more than banners. We have to make them more than banners. So that conversation is the one that needs to be had at the highest levels of Georgetown, to be a place whose faith does justice. I want to do the banner. That's why I came. And I think that conversation is going on, and it has to be pushed by students like you to do that. So thank you very much. Over here.
Thank you. I'm a master's student at Georgetown, and my question stems from what I was noticing in the pamphlet earlier. There are some denominations mentioned on the Christians Against Nationalism packet that is here tonight, and there are others that I know of that are not on that list. So I'm curious, as leaders and scholars in the field, what has engagement with other denomination leadership groups looked like, and what are some challenges that you may have noticed within those spaces?
Amanda, that's yours.
Yeah, it is. Well, great question. I do want to emphasize that Christians Against Christian Nationalism is a grassroots network. So we asked some prominent leaders, some of whom are seated here on the stage with me, to endorse our project when we launched back in 2019, and asked them to encourage people in their churches to review the project and to sign on. But it really is something for individual Christians, whether they're in pews or not, because that's a whole nother conversation we didn't have tonight, but how many people who are Christians who are not actively involved in a faith community, but who are still claiming that title. So I will say that engagement in certain spaces by leaders has been more difficult because of the perception that Christian nationalism has created. That this idea, when you have one segment of religious life, white evangelicals who voted 80% for one candidate in 2016, there is something going on where Christian nationalism is infiltrating Christianity more in some of those circles than in other circles. And so I do think that it takes some extra bravery by certain leaders in some circles to call out Christian nationalism in their congregations versus other congregations. But we are going to need a broad-based response from Christians from all perspectives if we're going to combat Christian nationalism. And when you go to christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org, one great thing, if you're a Christian, please look at the statement and sign it. But you can also go look at nearly 30,000 people who have listed publicly where they live and how they identify religiously, and you will see a broad diversity of individual Christians on that list. So this isn't just a left Christian movement. This is a movement that spans Christian life, and we might be seeing more leadership from laity than from the top leaders in some circles. And wherever that comes, I think we need a groundswell of response.
A lot of this will come down to what local pastors are willing to say and do.
Yep.
Right. Over here. Oh, no, here.
Hi there. Thanks so much for this great conversation. Thinking right along those lines about what to do in the local parish community context, our churches are not only segregated by race, they're also segregated by ideology oftentimes. And I know that a lot of clergy are hesitant to talk about these type of themes for both the sense of creating an echo chamber effect that we're already talking to the converted, but nevertheless, we want it to be effective. And so Bishop Curry talking about taking Christ in us to be formed in us from St. Paul, really, how do we cultivate that at the parish level where it doesn't feel like we're just talking to people who are already like-minded?
I do. I mean, I'm blessed in one respect in that I've had to, when I was Bishop of North Carolina before I became presiding bishop, before that I had been a parish priest in historically black congregations. So I got used to singing to the choir. Now, every once in a while, I had to say something that choir didn't want to hear either. But I had gotten used. And when I became a bishop, all of a sudden, I was confronted with, how do you say, a multilingual, a diverse sociology, which is to say that congregations of Republicans and Democrats and independents and peoples whose worldviews were reflective of that. And I had to find language that was authentic, but that could speak to that whole group. And I got to tell you, and I'm not just saying this because go back to the text. Let the text do the teaching. I'm telling you, Jesus is very helpful. And what I've discovered is, and I've been as presiding bishop, I've been in congregations where, we may vote differently. I never say, but I could guess. We probably do. But that doesn't matter. I said, look, I'm here to talk about Jesus with you. And I'm here to help you, just as I have to help myself, apply what he has taught us and said to us in my life and in our corporate life. Now, I'm not going to tell you exactly how you got to do it, but you got to love your neighbor. Mm-hmm. You may not like them, but you got to love them. Mm-hmm. And that means doing something. It doesn't mean just a good feeling. Now, that's not, you see what I'm saying? That kind of teaching and then letting people engage with Jesus themselves engage with the text themselves and say, look, you pray for me. There was a member of Congress who actually, we have become friends. And trust me, we are so far apart on everything. But he loves the Episcopal Church and he loves our Lord. And I said, brother, we'll figure it out. We're going to work this one out. But I used to go into the office and I would see the President Trump's, signature on the wall and all that kind of stuff. I said, we're going to work it out. we're going to work it out. So I'm saying relationship is crucial, but also relationship with that Jesus, helping people engage the text. And for Episcopalians, engaging the New Testament, especially the Gospels, as our way of understanding what God may be trying to say to us. And I think that becomes, I'm telling you, Jesus is, I don't want to say bipartisan, that's too narrow. But you know what I mean. He can speak to more folk than I can just on my own. And I think that's true for you, and it's true for all of us. Go to the text. Let Jesus do the talking. Oh, I'll stop. But that's...
And when they wrestle with the text, they'll realize the Good Samaritan parable. The point is, your neighbor probably doesn't live in your neighborhood.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
That's
here.
right.
Hello, thank you all for coming. My name is Jack. I'm a first-year student in the SFS. I come from a pretty conservative area where people feel turned off by white Christian nationalist ideology, but aren't willing to vote Democrat on that issue alone. Mm-hmm. What do you say to these voters, and how can they make a change without switching their ticket?
Good. Wow. Ooh.
Yeah.
That's
well, yeah, I think. Well, so. I think that often happens at the level of primaries is a good example of, so you don't have to choose that particular candidate, you can primary that. So, but what is happening, this is just kind of the really negative phenomenon of polarization in the United States is that because of gerrymandering, because districts are so kind of partisan already, really it seems like the goal of primaries, at least in Oklahoma where I am, I'll give you the example of that. So in Oklahoma where I am, it's all Republican, everybody's going to be a Republican. So like the goal of the Republican kind of like competition there in the primaries is to basically kind of label your opponent a rhino and go as hard right as possible in the hopes that you can say, hey, I'm the most hardcore conservative you could possibly be, and to say outrageous things and to kind of get there. Hopefully, and historically, that meant you would eventually come back towards the middle. And that's not really happening anymore. They're just kind of staying there on the fringe. So I think for those who want to vote conservative, I think it actually takes some mobilization to counter that idea that like we will go for the more not candidate that can win, but the candidate who actually sticks to our principles. Like to actually be a principled voter, in other words, like to not be sucked into kind of like the partisan identity and to say like, well, whoever goes the most radical kind of like anti-Pelosi or anti-whatever that you can, but actually will govern well, has experience, will actually, seems to be a person of character, if that is still a thing.
Yeah.
So like the idea that you will actually promote those kinds of candidates as conservative candidates, I think is something that you can stick to your principles without having to vote the other ticket. Does that make sense? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there are more conservatives than we know who feel also politically homeless these days. Mm-hmm. Conservatives who feel politically homeless too.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to the panel for, especially on this topic and with this kind of gravity. It's very refreshing. I'm Pace. I'm a senior in the college. I study history. And Professor Perry brought up don't boo vote as a way to combat white Christian nationalism alongside Reverend Curry's wonderful anecdote about mobilizing love. But we know that white Christian nationalism, as we've mentioned, manifests extensively outside of electoral politics, as we saw so tragically at Charlottesville, at Tree of Life, at Emmanuel AME, and countless other hate crimes that don't make the news. To what extent must, as Reverend Curry said and didn't say, normal, sane people, to what extent must they mobilize in direct action, both pastor and parishioner, at political events and protests that aren't necessarily a ballot box?
Let's take that.
So I'll just say something and then I'll pass it along. I just want to echo. I think they have all said this, and I want to add my voice to it as well. even research on social science research would say it really does take a critical capacity of people to speak against something for people to realize, oh, this is not something we all believe. So within social psychology, we call this the phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance, and it often is studied in contexts where like young people will incorrectly perceive that the majority of their peers believe something or do something that they don't really. So like, for example, on the college campus, just give you an example, like the perception among young people that all of my peers are into just kind of like hookup sex all the time, or all of my peers are into illicit drugs all the time, or binge drinking. When you do surveys, that's not necessarily the case, right? But among young people, if there is the perception that everybody is doing this, they will violate their own kind of like norm structure and say, well, I guess this is kind of like what everybody's, so I guess I'm going to kind of go along with this culture. It takes a critical capacity of people to say, I'm not into that at all. Like, why are you guys into that? You know, and so it was same thing with Christian nationalism, the same kind of phenomenon. Like, it takes a critical capacity of leaders and people in the pews to say, this isn't what I believe. This isn't what it means to be a Christian for me. You guys believe that? I don't believe that. And enough people within the congregations to speak out against that, to say, this is not what we feel about democracy. This isn't me. That is not. But that takes courage. I mean, like, that takes courage, especially among pastors. We have seen in Norman. I'll speak to Norman. All of the pastors of Norman got on my kids' soccer team. So like all of their kids are like playing soccer with my kids. So it's me and all of the pastors of Norman. And we have been talking about for the last couple of years what's going on in their churches. And the last several years has been this powerful sorting time where if you said one thing about George Floyd, people said, you're too woke, you guys have gone woke, you're probably into CRT, I'm out of here. Mm-hmm. Or if you didn't back Trump in 2020, or if you did, or if like you didn't say anything about George Floyd, people left, right? So people are siloing, and it takes courage when you know as a pastor you are not discipling your people as much as Tucker Carlson is, or whoever, or Hannity, or anything like that. It takes the spiritual courage to say, like, I am going to say something that people in my church will not like and might get me in trouble. It takes enough people.
Yeah. And I would just say, I agree that silence right now is complicity. So we have a moral obligation to speak out. And in Christians Against Christian Nationalism, the centerpiece is this statement of unifying principles. And the very first one is people of all faiths and none have the right and the responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. Right. So I think that this is, to be political is not the problem, right? The problem is when you insist that the government reflect your theological views, or you think that only people who are like me religiously belong fully in the country. But I think this maybe fear about engaging politically has left a vacuum for Christians like us who are concerned about Christian nationalism, who aren't engaging as much as they should in the public square.
I'm going to try and get to the people standing. If we could keep our questions succinct and no more people getting in line, we'll do our best to get through these questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Paul, DC resident, unaffiliated with the university, but thank you for hosting this to the center and the university. Dr. Perry, early on you mentioned that one of the great fears of white Christian nationalists is that they're trying to take our heritage away. Right. And that language hit me really hard. There are other groups in this country that fear that people are trying to take their heritage away, and I'm speaking in particular about apologists for the Confederacy. You see any link? Is that just coincidence, or is there something there?
Yeah, so if you're Jim referenced our book, The Flag and the Cross. I mean, we actually analyze that very thing with data, and we find that the correlation is basically a linear line between how much you affirm Christian nationalist ideology and your desire to, your rejection of, like, say, removing Confederate statues or monuments because you feel like those things support your heritage. I mean, it's a very, very tight correlation. Also, the idea that you deny that the Civil War was even about race at all, or slavery, that you believe historians think, oh, it's about states' rights, or that kind of thing. So, and part of that has to do with the idea that, like, if you subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology, it's very important to you that America's history is whitewashed in some important ways, that we get rid of the talk about how we have this racialized social system, that our history has been very profoundly shaped by racial injustice. We have found reason to that point. In Oklahoma, the guy who was literally about to win the state superintendent for education is a Christian nationalist who actually, constantly goes to Twitter and talks about like woke ideology. He's going to institute mandatory patriotic education. We've actually have survey data that shows that Christian nationalism is the number one predictor that you feel like, hey, teachers should be required to teach history in such a way that reinforces American patriotism rather than questions it. So I think these kinds of issues are in lockstep. Yep.
Let's go back here, a longer line, a bunch of students over here, so go ahead. Go ahead, over here.
Jeff Stenzel, my question, I'm looking for two numbers from each of you. And my question is, what share of Christian nationalists do you think would self-identify as white Christian nationalists? And what share would it self-identify as anti-white Christian nationalists?
So very few people, so we have survey data on these kinds of things. So this is data that I haven't shared yet, so we actually just got it this week. So we ask Americans, it's the first survey that I'm aware of where we actually ask Americans whether the label Christian nationalist describes you. And we found that 25% of Americans say at some level, somewhat or very well, that Christian nationalist describes them. They don't say white Christian nationalist because that just sounds like white supremacist or white nationalist. Very few people would do that. But Christian nationalist itself describes them. 45% of Republicans embrace that label. Over half of white evangelicals. We have other numbers on that, but it was surprisingly high when I first got the numbers back. Now, how many people would say that doesn't define me is the majority of Americans. The majority of Americans are either undecided on that. The majority say that doesn't describe me.
The majority of white Christian nationalists, would they say, the majority of Christian nationalists, would they say, no, I'm not a white Christian nationalist? That sounds racist.
If we appended the label white to it, I'm sure they would. Yeah. Because it comes with the charge of like, hey, you're a racist. To be fair, like I usually don't, and this is I don't mind. I want to make this point. Up until recently, I have tried to assiduously avoid calling people Christian nationalists because it's kind of like calling people racists and fascists, right? Like people don't like labels, and that kind of polarizes people immediately. I'd much rather talk about the ideology of Christian nationalism that exists on a spectrum, right? And so it wasn't until recently that I could actually speak about it as a coherent identity, people talking about themselves in those labels.
Okay, back over here.
Thank you very much. I'm Terry, former Roman Catholic nun, and coming back to, I am a Christian, I guess, so I can do this work. So it struck me, I came here thinking that Christian nationalism was riled up by the cynical power grabbers. But as I'm listening, what came to me is they didn't just make it up out of whole cloth. There's stuff in the religions themselves, some of the things that made me leave, like gay is wrong, abortion is wrong, women should be second-class citizens, all of those things. How much of that has to be actually addressed in order for this to actually have any substance to it? Because they didn't just make it up. We have held on to some of these teachings and still do. The American bishops sent out a letter before Trump's election that you can't vote for somebody who thinks choice is okay. I'll take my answer sitting down.
How do other issues play into this?
No, do they have to be addressed by the...
Do they need to be addressed to deal with this, right?
Thank you.
Thoughts?
I think they do need to be addressed by people in those religious communities. I mean, this is really very much about being self-reflective and self-critical about how much of our faith and our religious exercise is Christianity, how much has Christian nationalism influenced how we understand our own faith. So I think if we are truly to work to dismantle Christian nationalism, which is our long-term goal, and it will take a long time to do that, then that has to be part of the conversation. And as a religious freedom advocate, that has to be done from within the tradition. That's not something that can be authentically done by anyone who's not working, I think, within that tradition.
Okay, we could talk about all these questions for so much longer, but let's get to the last few questions here.
I'm not important. I'm just a grad student that's into Jesus. But my question is, in the struggle against white Christian nationalism or Christian nationalism as a whole, what would you say is the role of Christians from marginalized communities, such as Christians of color or Christians from the LGBTQ community?
Great question. Who'd like to take that?
I'll just say, I'll just speak to that briefly. I would like to, as a Christian who is none of those things, I'm not from a marginalized anything. I'm a majority, every almost aspect of my identity is from some kind of majority culture. I would much prefer that my brothers and sisters don't have to defend themselves in that way, that I would stick up for them and fight for them, and that is, I feel like, my responsibility. And I also happen to feel like that is the scariest thing to people who have bought into the ideology of Christian nationalism, that I, as an insider to their world, would speak out against that, which is why they're often so keen to otherize people like me. So if a David French, if a Russell Moore, if a Tim Keller, who are conservative evangelicals, speak out against Christian nationalism, they immediately get labeled as oh, you guys are now woke and liberal and leftist and that kind of thing, which is absurd. It's absurd. But their goal is to say, oh, those guys are outsiders, now they can't speak to us. It terrifies these people and these leaders when insiders will say, that is off, that is wrong, right? So I certainly would not discourage people of color, communities, faith communities who are minorities from being able to speak out against this. My preference, though, would be people like me would stand up first and shield them from that kind of attack and discrimination first.
Just one quick point on that. What I'm hearing all the time, particularly from black clergy, is how terrified they are of this, this white Christian nationalism. And they're saying, why does people think everyone's a Christian who's this? You guys got to speak up and say, no, it's not this. You guys speak up and say, because, it's coming down on us, all this. So you guys got to speak and say, no, this isn't Christian. This is not what it means. So I'm hearing a real fear that I haven't heard for a long time.
Just quick, let me jump in quick.
Yeah.
You know where Jesus said, wherever two or three gather together in my name, there I am in the midst of them? One thing I've learned about black folk, we aren't a minority anymore. I think that's part of the issue with the rise of that black and brown. I think there's some other issues we haven't touched on yet that are behind us. But it's important for people of color, black, brown, Latino, all of us, Asian, must speak up. We have to speak up whether we like it or not. And sometimes that's risky. Okay, yeah, that's risky.
It is.
But it's also important for us to join hands with our sisters and brothers. I'm trying to get y'all's hands. I'm trying to get y'all's hands. To join hands, because when we all join hands and we all speak up, that is a different thing. And so I think it's both and, but you're absolutely right. I'm not disagreeing, but I think we've got to join hands.
Indeed. All right, two more. Go ahead. Yeah, that over here.
Hi, I'm Jim Vitarello, old friend of Jim Wallace and big admirer of Bishop Curry since I'm a longtime member of the Washington National Cathedral. And I love that cathedral. My kids all went to school there. My wife had a memorial service there, thanks to Dean Randy. And so I believe very much what you're doing, but I was a little surprised that no one's explicitly mentioned, unless my hearing aid's not working well, the critically important, expansive role of white evangelical culture. A new book just came out called A Great Name, Jesus and John Wayne. I don't know if you've heard about it. Written by an amazing woman who grew up in the center of white Christian evangelism in Sioux County, Iowa, which is probably the most conservative and the most evangelical county in all of Iowa. And she's written this book, and she talks a lot about how important Christian, music and books, but particularly Christian radio stations and TV stations. On the mainstream side of Christianity, we don't have anything close to that. And I think until we deal with that problem, right, this culture, in my opinion, is even be worse in terms of spreading Christian nationalism than political ideology.
Great book. I would recommend that. There's so much on this topic. I think when we talk about the definition, we often say it's a political ideology and a cultural framework. And all of those symbols and narratives and values that get repeated do work to entrench this idea. Yeah, absolutely. And it shows what we're up against. So, yeah.
It is a great, great book.
Yes.
Another must-read book. Okay, last question, please.
Hi, my name's Alexia. I'm a medical student. Thank you all for coming out here. I just wanted to say, I'm really happy that the definition and the ideology of white Christian nationalism was explained, because I'll say, maybe it was me being a little ignorant of the term. For example, it seems like when you guys were defining white Christian nationalism, each of you pointed out that it is an ideology and it's not representative of the people, the groups within that label. However, when making titles using these terms such as white or Christians, it can be perceived somewhat discriminatory towards these groups. And I was just wondering if you've considered, I know you didn't coin this term, but if it's ever been considered to coin a term that was more so targeting the specific heinous groups of, or heinous acts of people. For example, how you brought up the January 6th acts, those heinous acts, instead of labels for people such as white or Christians that, and the acts that misrepresent Christianity or white people.
Yeah.
Who would like to pick it up?
Well, I think it's an important point, and I also think we run the risk by repeating Christian with Christian nationalism of perpetuating idea that is Christian, right, as opposed to the kind of Christianity that we're talking about. The problem that we're getting at, I think, is how pervasive this issue is. So we can't limit it to just the most extreme examples or say, well, there's only, a few Christian nationalists or extremists that we are trying to deal with here. But instead, I think the broadness of the term helps us understand that it's something that impacts us all. But terms are imperfect, right? And so I think that's where we need better conversation definitions, and to continue to distinguish what we're talking about. Christian nationalism is not Christianity, is not saying that all Christians are bad, and to bring more understanding when it comes to what we're talking about with whiteness. I think that could be a whole nother session, right? Is the white supremacy aspects of Christian nationalism.
Yeah. Well, let me close with another text, lifting up text tonight from Apostle Paul, Romans 12. It says, "Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your minds." And one translation is, "Don't let the world squeeze you into its mold." This is how religion gets squeezed into molds, political molds and categories and ideologies. And coming back to what it means to not be conformed to the world, but be transformed. Transformed. I think finally it's transcendence that can transcend all these political categories. So how we appeal to the best in our faith. Good religion is a better answer to bad religion than no religion. And we're not going to beat this just by secularism, just by people moving away from faith, which some like to think is the answer. It's going to be people who have faith holding hands and getting ready for the risk, because it's going to be costly. But that's why you got to be holding hands and not be by yourself. So tonight we've been holding hands, and I appreciate all of you coming. Let's share our love with these guests here tonight. And thank you all very much. We're going to reconvene the elders in Advent about reclaiming Jesus. So this isn't the end, is just the beginning. Thanks so much.